What's good? It's your brother PromoatBlack. I know living in a system can be real whack, so I'm gonna give you the tax so you know how to react. This is Homestead with PromoatBlack. How y'all doing, man? I wanted to come to you today and talk to you about why I homestead and why I believe that homesteading is important. That I definitely believe it's important for Black people to do as a whole. I first start off by saying people always want to talk about what Black people won't do, especially when it comes to building for ourselves and doing for ourselves. And I wanted to dispel that myth by using the powernomics principles I learned from my brother Dr. Claude Anderson. That brother really showed me not just so much the importance of ownership and having wealth, because we all know the importance of that living in capitalism, but it's more about having the ability to control your own destiny, to control your own outcomes, and to just live more peaceably, living on your, in your own arena. Ideally, I would say, Black people as a whole should buy up, grandma's house, anything that we can own and control, whether it's to lease out. And I know people understand this, but as a people, as a whole, as far as our economic boycotts, I think we're starting to really wake up to what Dr. Claude Anderson was saying. So for me, you know, I just feel like I'm getting back to raising, doing things how my ancestors used to do. We had a lot more power and freedom back then because they couldn't control what we ate. We grew our own food. We made our own homes. We built brick homes. I mean, we were self sufficient because we had no choice. No one would give us anything, especially after Reconstruction, which is an excellent example of how Black people 10 years removed from slavery were able to accomplish a lot of things. You hear about their reading ability, you hear about them running for politics, but these people are coming off a plantation where nowhere to go, no home, whatever land they were allotted based on, their freedom and, dealing with that plantation owner. And, we know about sharecropping and things that came after. But as far as them building on their own, creating their own homes, creating their own clothes, I would argue that they had less power over us then, especially before integration. And honestly, I mean, they only allowed us to raise certain animals, which is kind of why I'm back to that. Anything that I can do, as the old saying goes, if you give them the power to feed you, you give them the power to starve you. And I think that's why, as a whole, we just gotta separate ourselves from that. I also go as far as to say, that God helps those who helps themselves. I know the struggle, that the system puts on us. I know the struggle of, getting by day to day. And this is why I'm a big advocate for empowerment as far as your life not just amounting to working a job, your life amounting to building with your brethren, as far as having that wealth, as far as passive income, as far as just, owning and controlling our own things. And for me, I came from Texas. I went to college, came to Colorado. I was doing everything the way that they told me to do it, as far as getting a college degree, as far as, this is the steps you need to take as far as getting a college degree, getting a good job, getting a home. And I already had my wife. Thank God for her. She's been a blessing. So that's the one thing I could say, doing what, the society tells you, that actually paid off for me. But everything else didn't seem to go that way. Every time I was working at these jobs, there was always issues. Anybody who's dealt with racial animus at the job, but people pretend it's not there. Yet, somehow when there's mass layoffs, last hired, first fired still rings true. So for me, this became a matter of sacrifice. After 2020, I was at a point where I was like, I never want to be in a situation where I have to worry about my livelihood based on, a job, as far as like not being able to pay rent because I got laid off. It's like, man, that happened to me one time. And I just kind of vowed to my family, like never again. And at this time I was blessed, with powernomics. I was a very religious guy. So I knew the importance of building wealth, but I was one of those people who didn't want to, who, you go through the eye of the donkey. It's easier for the eye of the donkey than, a rich person to make it to heaven, all kind of thing. And that book really showed me how there's a spiritual element to not just obtaining wealth, but how you use the wealth, especially to build up your people, and especially to, ensure that your family and your children have something when you pass on. So that was a big part of why I wanted to do this. But this was not easy. Like I said, sacrifice, man. My wife and I, with our, at the time, 2-year-old daughter, lived in an RV for one whole year, man. We moved out here on our 5 acres. Thank God we were able to, employ powernomics principles in order to, have a family member help us to purchase the property. And then, we were here on the RV with nothing. So, like everyone says, who's a staunch reparationist like I am, you have to be able to develop that land. You need money and funds to develop your land. Yeah, you can get the land, but there is a lot that, comes into play once you have it. Yeah, the property taxes, but, building it up. And so this is just, turning something, the journey of, that's what you pretty much watching is the journey of us creating, as we go along, as you see in the background, it's chicken coop, way back there is that RV that we lived in. You can partially see our home to an extent, but that's just to show you the levels of like everybody I knew who came out here to an extent. When you live in the middle of nowhere, you have to have something to start off with. And that was us starting with that RV, man. I know a lot of people would not want to necessarily live that way, although we were able to save a lot of money because I didn't have to pay any rent, didn't have to pay any lights. So, as far as being able to accumulate, wealth, but like you said, you still have the land development piece. And so, it's definitely a journey, man. It's definitely a journey. I've been here for some years, and it's taken some years to get things going. I've had passive income. I've not had passive income. I've had to get jobs, lost jobs. Moving around to get things paid for, to get things set up. You know what I mean? And like I said, that's a tough pill to swallow as far as the levels and stages of getting things set up. I was always telling my wife that I want us to be just as comfortable as we would have been in the city. Um, there was a guy who told me, "Oh, some people out here live like the 1800s." It's like, nah, man, I'm Black American. I'm not going back to the 1800s. So, I made a point to make sure that my family and I were comfortable, that we were safe. That was my top priority. That's, like I said, a lot of reason why, even though I've been out here for a few years, just now getting this on camera, just now getting it uploaded to YouTube, because we had to focus on, what we had in front of us as far as getting things set up. So yeah, God made a way for us to move into our home. But like I said, still, as far as like the solar, which I'm going to make a whole series on coming up for you guys, it took steps and there was phases to building all that stuff up, because every piece of that costs money, from the controller to the batteries themselves, the panels. So it takes time to build these things up, but the end result is now, I don't have to pay a lot of bills. And people, I know it's funny because I keep repeating that, but I'm repeating it because, man, anybody who's paid that car note off a little bit sooner, than when it was due, anyone who was blessed to have the funds to get that mortgage paid off ahead of time knows the power of what I mean by, once you have that monkey off your back, once you're able to use that money as disposable income or as passive income, it's a very powerful thing, but you have to build yourself up to that point. I'm a city boy. I grew up in Houston originally, and for me, I met my wife and she was a country girl. So even this kind of living was a little bit foreign to me. But, my wife, she kind of helped me out a lot as far as making that adjustments. And I'd say, like, the big difference from living in the city, man, a lot more peace and autonomy, man. I remember a lot of people, you'd always deal with noise complaints or someone feeling some type of way because they could hear your music, or, just the little microaggressions that we, deal with and having neighbors. I used to watch this show, Fear Thy Neighbor, as far as just like, man, neighbors can be dangerous if things go sour. So for me, to an extent, having this open range to, you know, be able to have peace and autonomy to let my kids run around without, having to worry about them getting kidnapped is a big relief. I mean, being able to see the stars at night is also a major thing. Coming from the city, I've seen the stars, but not in the magnificence it is to see them out here, as far as seeing the rips in the Milky Way, as far as, just really being able to see how beautiful it is. You know what I mean? It's a great thing, to really take it all in. Don't get me wrong, part of this, has a little bit to do with a little bit of doomsday prepping. It's one of those like, hey, with technology taking over, if things go left, things go a little crazy. I'm already on my own land. The idea is to be able to eventually be able to feed ourselves and to be self-sufficient, where I won't have to leave. And that'll allow me the ability to, weather some storms, ideally. Now, don't get me wrong, nuclear holocaust, crazy viruses and stuff, but that's kind of the lesson we learned from 2020. You can't escape the nuclear part, but you can, maybe get a little distance to protect yourself. But as far as, my people, FBA, and just dealing with, certain neighbors, certain neighborhoods, as far as, even if you're, in a situation where people just don't like seeing you, you come up and you get a home, or you're able to, you know, level up and people feel some type of way about it and you have to deal with that. It's like, I like being able to level up without people being all in my business and knowing what I have and knowing what I'm bringing in my home. But it's not the end all be all. Like I said, you still need your reparations, man. We're still owed 40 acres in the mule. I only have 5. And living on 5, I'm realizing like how much 40 acres really is. I mean, that's enough to really, build up something, build up an industry, build up a town, build up a village, build up a community, where you have that autonomy and freedom to protect yourself, to control your environment, to not have to worry about, folks trying to take advantage of you or putting you in a precarious situation just because they're a police officer. There's just, for me, there's just a lot of freedom, to this style of living. It comes with the sacrifice, it comes with this hard work, but anything that's hard, is worth it, as far as, what you can accomplish on the other end of things, as far as what you can accomplish at the end of that journey. And so for us, um, ideally, the end of my journey, my kids will be able to carry this on. There's a guy, a neighbor of mine that lives kind of down the street. I take inspiration from. Not down the street. He lives pretty far away, but this guy has older children than I, and I could basically, in my passing, I could see that, eventually he got them their own mobile home on their land as well. And I was like, man, that's a beautiful thing to have bought that land and been able to share, with your family for generations. People can go off to college and school, get married, come back, and, have somewhere they can live and be happy and be peaceful and thrive and grow. And so that's why I just bring it up, man. I know it's, you know, not everyone wants to just pack up and move to the middle of nowhere, but I don't know about you, man. I just got tired of dealing with it, man. No matter if I was just living by someone or even when I was working, it just got to the point where, I wanted the freedom to be left alone. I am a Black American. I've heard for, all the time in school about manifest destiny and the Homestead Act and people getting their own land. So it's like, why not I? And in Texas, like I told you guys in a previous video, unfortunately, my family land was stripped away, which is why I'm such a big reparationist on, getting what's ours back in the form of cash payments in all other areas as far as cut that check. Then you got these HOAs. I have a friend who lives in a townhome right now. He always tells me about how he has to deal with HOAs. I've seen on YouTube how predatory HOAs can be. And so it's a beautiful thing as far as homesteading. Like, I'm not going to pay someone for them to tell me what I can and cannot do on my own land or with my own house and with my own property. And then you pay, like I said, you're paying into this. That's terrible. So that's a major reason why that's why I'm really big on self-sufficiency, on us as a people, like Dr. Claude Anderson said, taking care of ourselves, being able to provide the needs and goods and services to each other so that we can have a profitable and prosperous community. We build that self-sufficiency first, we get our economics in order, then we can pivot back to the politics. And so, like I said, he said it best, building competitive communities. We get our group economics together, then we can all come together and start industrializing, modernizing our farms. And even if not that, just whatever warehouses, distribution, just us getting to that point where we're a step ahead. But in doing all this, them cutting the check is just the beginning of all that. And, with us making these moves, we'll replace the system of white supremacy with the system of justice. Once again, I appreciate you taking time out to listen to this video, to watch me and my wife put our fencing together around our garden. Please feel free to like and subscribe. Till next time. Peace.